At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Girl A by Abigail Dean and Jeffery Deaver's Coulter Shaw novels, along with any of his other works on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the panelists a question by clicking on the Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we will try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Abigail Dean currently works as a lawyer for Google, but as an avid lover of books, however, she also worked as a bookseller for Waterstones. Her debut novel, Girl A, sold in the UK after a 9-way auction to HarperCollins, who published it in January 2021. Right now, Abigail is based in London and is working on her second novel, The Conspiracies. Next off, we have Jeffery Deaver. He is the #1 international best-selling and award-winning author of more than 40 novels and 30 collections of short stories. His books are sold in 150 countries and translated into 25 languages. His next Coulter Shaw novel, The Final Twist, will be published with Putnam on May 11, 2021. Please join me in welcoming Abigail Dean and Jeffery Deaver to Politics and Prose Live.
Well, thank you so much, Isa, and my thanks too to Politics and Prose, one of the preeminent bookstores in the world. As a fellow who used to live in DC, I haunted the place frequently, bought many of my books there. And welcome guests, and welcome Abigail. It's delightful to talk to you, and I must say, it's a true pleasure to have this conversation. I cannot think, and I'd be really hard pressed to come up with another debut novel that was as accomplished as Girl A. I read it in about 1.5 days, and it thrilled me. It was a real pleasure to read. Now, we could use up the entire hour reading some of the stellar notices, but I'm just going to quote one that typifies the response to this superb novel. This is a starred review from Booklist. A tour de force, beautifully written, richly imagined, and compulsively readable. Add to this its grave, sometimes ominous tone, and the result is unforgettable. And I will attest to every one of those words. So let's get started. Now, and I should mention a matter of housekeeping. We'll discuss the book for about 45 minutes or so and leave plenty of time for questions. And there's a way to do that, I think, as Isa was saying. So think of something good. We're going to cover a lot of topics here, but I imagine you'll be able to come up with some original thoughts that I have not considered. Now, we're certainly going to talk about the novel at length, but Abigail, first, maybe you could tell us about your path to writing Girl A. And I have to say, I was struck by kind of an odd coincidence. I began writing in my teens, as I believe you did. Thank goodness all of those incipient works of mine, I think, are lost to the ages. I'm terrified that they will be discovered, much to my shame. But anyway, then I gave up writing for a while to follow a career at law. And then I was drawn back to writing in my 30s, which is when I published my first novel. I think that may be a bit of a parallel to your story, but tell us a bit about how you came to write fiction and how Girl A came about.
Sure. So I think that certainly are some strange parallels, Jeffrey, definitely. I loved writing as a child. Kind of in my late, kind of thinking like when I was 9 or 10, I would write stories about my various stuffed animals. And, as a teenager, there would be some painful kind of probably love poetry, some pretty dire attempts at fan fiction as well, which I absolutely was kind of really into various fandoms as a teenager. And I think it's quite a strange thing happened, I think, when I went to university and kind of hit my early 20s, which was that I guess I sort of started to see writing as a bit of a pipe dream. To be entirely honest, it wasn't that I kind of lost the love of it, But I think I lost all sort of hope that it was ever something that would be for me, that I was, the kind of person who could be a writer. So yeah, I kind of felt, well, in that case, I need to do another job, and I need to do a job for me that involves words, at least. Like, that's something that I do still love. And yeah, I think for kind of great stretch of my 20s, I barely wrote at all. And it was a combination, I think, in terms of an absence of time. My life was mostly lived in offices and very kind of fluorescent departure lounges or meeting rooms. And also a sort of, I think I had kind of given up on this being something that was feasible. And so it wasn't until I was coming up to my 30th birthday, and I sort of had a particularly dire period at work. As I think, I'm sure in your legal career, you also experience that you can lose complete months, I think, to the office. And I think I started pretty frankly to realize that I wasn't hugely happy. And part of that was having completely abandoned probably the thing that I loved and enjoyed the most. So I ended up leaving my kind of legal job at a law firm, and kind of made a bit of a deal with myself and said, okay, have 3 months off work. The deal is you need to write as if it's a profession. You need to kind of take this relatively seriously. And for those 3 months, I had very grand delusions that I'd do a kind of William Faulkner, 6 weeks, and I'd have a novel. That did not happen, unsurprisingly. But I did end that period with a third of a novel, a third of Girl A. And I think I was just invested enough then to think, okay, there's going to be some late nights and some long weekends, but you've got to kind of keep going with the story and with this family and with these characters.
And you mentioned something quite interesting about the words. Law, I have found, and we can chat a little bit more about this if you like, is about words, either verbally, if you're in England, it would be a barrister, a solicitor if you're doing the business law. Same thing, we have the 2 tracks here in America, but it is about clear communication. And I would say that my training at law kind of helped me focus in on being a clear writer, clear communicator. It certainly helped, because if you get a word wrong, there can be drastic consequences to that. So I suspect maybe it helped you. Of course, your writing style is very non-legal. It's a very lyrical style. But with law, you did think very hard about getting the correct word, making sure every syllable counted.
Yeah, I do think that they are relatively complementary in a strange, sort of unexpected way, because as you said, people often think of legal writing as being jargon and sometimes being almost indecipherable. I think that one thing that it's made me think of all the time is ambiguities. And in law, in a way, any ambiguity in a sentence or in a paragraph needs to be in your favor. Right. Ideally, you kind of erase it. But in writing, I think ambiguity is this kind of like fantastic thing. That a character's, the words that they say, or, the way that they're described when they come into a room, ambiguities can work kind of hugely in your favor. And I think, often they're what makes reading a book so interesting, that 2 people can leave with entirely different impressions. So I think I've had to sort of coax myself into enjoying the ambiguity again, and not trying to erase it entirely as I do as a lawyer. Interesting
concept, ambiguity, another arrow in the quiver of writers, a tool that they can use. Now, I love stories in which the past comes home to roost in the present. And Girl A is a perfect example of that. And this particular past is quite something indeed. Now, because of the surprises and the revelations that await the readers in Girl A, I'm only going to say this, and this will maybe be a launching pad for you to share more. We meet our wonderful protagonist, Lex Gracie, who is an attorney in New York, and she's summoned back to England to settle some of her family's financial and personal matters after she fled her home 15 years ago. And again, at the risk of committing the sin of spoiling, I will now hand off to you, Abigail, if you would like to tell us a bit more, maybe about Lex and the plot of Girl A to the extent you can, because it's so layered and it is such a journey for the reader. I would be terrified about giving anything away, but please, I'll let you take it from there if you would.
Sure. So I guess in a way, maybe I can start by sort of tying Lex back to the title of the book. And I think that one of the things that a few people have been surprised at when they read Girl A is that Lex manages to escape from her family home, which is becomes known as the House of Horrors in the press. Very, very early on. So I feel confident, that in a way that's not a spoiler. And in managing to escape from her parents, what has really become a kind of very, very strict religious cult, she frees her 6 brothers and sisters and exposes her parents' crimes. And as a result of that escape, Lex kind of becomes known as Girl A. It's the pseudonym that she is given in the media and in court documents as being the kind of the figure who escaped. So it both gives her anonymity, but it also becomes this kind of millstone to be carried throughout her life, this kind of strange renown in this name. And when Lex does receive news of her mother's death, this is 15 years after she escaped from the house. At that point, she's really doing everything she can to avoid thinking about her childhood. She's almost entirely severed herself from her family. And it's this kind of calling home that requires Lex to begin to reconnect with her siblings. She's a hopeful person. She's an incredibly resilient, I think really inspirational main character. But she is kind of, she's both escaped from the house, but she's also in a way escaped from her past entirely. And it's the reconnecting with her siblings and with their shared childhood that begins to prompt this reflection into the past and the revisiting of old battles and old alliances that were formed in that childhood. And it's for Lex to find out how they've translated into adulthood for the Gracie family.
And so well done, too. Now, you alluded to the phrase House of Horrors has a certain connotation to it. And Lex and her siblings have to confront some truly dark incidents that happened in their past. And you don't shy from exploring that. And yet you handle the narrative with consummate sensitivity. There's no sensationalism whatsoever in this. And in the end, I felt what came through with Girl A, the novel Girl A, was really hope. Was that one of your intentions? Was that a goal of yours in writing the book?
It was. It really was. And I think that a lot of that was Lex's character. I think that a lot of people might read, might read what Girl A is about and think, is this a book that I kind of want to delve into? And I think that ultimately having Lex be Girl A and be your lead into the Gracie family and their history means that it is a book about strength and resilience and hope, rather than about suffering. And I think it's something that I've often been interested in literature and in life in general, that, in the very kind of darkest events and often in the kind of darkest novels and narratives, that is sometimes where you get these kind of absolutely so tender and so moving human relationships. And I think that in Lex's relationships with her siblings, which range from everything from, Lex as being a real protector of some of her younger siblings to, having a sort of mix of intellectual admiration and intense rivalry with some of her other siblings. But you get these kind of, I think, really beautiful family dynamics that are actually in a way quite mundane and as sort of that they're particularly poignant in the House of Horrors, but I think that they will also echo with lots of people in terms of, they'll recognize their own family there as well.
Well, that very word leads to my next question, because I was struck in reading Girl A that it is about family, as so many great, you mentioned Faulkner before, and think of the plays of Eugene O'Neill. So many great works are about family. That's a subject that writers and other artists have addressed for years. Why does that subject interest you? Why were you drawn to the concept of family, siblings in particular, but nonetheless family in general?
I think that it's, I think that in families, in the sort of frankness of the dialogues that you have with your family, you are almost entirely yourself in them a lot of the time. And so I think it's a fantastic way, it's seeing kind of different family sagas of exploring character, I guess, and of just seeing how people are in their most kind of raw form. I'm thinking of some of my favorite TV shows, I guess, which are all dominated by family. I'm thinking of like 6 Feet Under and The Sopranos and Succession at present, all things that have these kind of incredibly tense and tender family relationships. And I think that for me, on a more kind of personal level, I come from a really small family. I'm an only child. And I have one cousin. It's a very, very compact family unit. And I think that right from childhood, I was interested in these stories of bigger families, everything from the Marches to like the Weasley family, into like, Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections and the family at the heart of that novel. I think in a way, perhaps it was a way to kind of explore these relationships that I just was not a party to. And when you're the outsider looking in, I think things are always particularly interesting because they're unusual. You have to kind of imagine what those relationships would look like for you. And I found myself doing that a lot. So I think right from an early age, I was writing a lot about sibling relationships, and I was kind of fascinated in them and kind of wanted to write my own bigger family in terms of something that was kind of absent for me and something that fascinated me by virtue of that.
Did I read that you had imaginary, like many kids have imaginary friends, you had imaginary siblings?
Yeah, I did. And I had an imaginary sister in particular, which readers of Girl A might find sort of particularly interesting in terms of that close sibling bond between Lex and her younger sister in particular. They're so close. I think that, I did want that close, that kind of close relationship. And yeah, I had some imaginary dinosaur friends as well, so I couldn't read into it too much. But there was definitely some
species involved. Well, writers. I've talked to so many writers, and I know my own childhood. If nothing else, I myself may not have had the skill at an early age to write, but I had the imagination. I could come up with some of the most far-fetched. But I have to ask: did you like pull your imaginary sister's pigtails and hide your imaginary brother's football?
I mean, it was way too idyllic, right? I mean, I think that's the thing. It was just having this fantastic companion. And I think often I would kind of look at my friends and their siblings and I'd realize, no, it's not quite like that. And I think that in Girl A, for Lex, it's certainly with her siblings, it is not quite not quite as I imagined it. There's some pretty caustic
Not quite.
moments.
No, the world of writers is divided into two camps. There are the plotters and the pantsers, as in seat of the pants. And of course, the plotters plan everything out ahead of time, if not everything, but plan much out. I'm a compulsive outliner, but some people just let the story go where it will. Now, the structure of Girl A I found fascinating from a craftsperson's point of view. The way you blend the past and the present seamlessly. The story, it had a musical quality to it. It would kind of ebb and flow. The scenes would ebb and flow. The emotions would ebb and flow. So could you talk a little bit for, possibly the writers out there in the audience or potential writers? How did you approach crafting the book and make it so seamless?
I'm going to have to ask as well what your plans look like in a minute, Jeffrey, because I'm really fascinated in that. So I think I fall somewhere between the two camps, because I very much like to know how a story will end, and I knew what the final scene of Girl A would be before I started writing it, pretty much. I was not very certain about how each of the different characters will get there. So that was something that I did work out in part as I went along. But what I do believe is that my the sort of the transitions between past and present in the novel came hugely out of the editing process. So I think that in terms of the novel relatively regularly flicks between the two time frames, and the number of times in editing that various scenes shifted, that something was brought in earlier or cut later, or was, I think it was probably another 9 months of work after the first draft was finished, alone, and then with my agent, and then with the editing team. One thing that I do find hugely helpful, though, and that I kind of find that it is my kind of plan develops as it goes along. So as I get ideas for future parts of the novel, I will drop them into my main master document, so that towards the end, for every scene, you already have these little breadcrumbs. You have things that you thought of that needed to reemerge, or that needed to, particular lines of dialogue even that you felt it would be great for a character to say at that moment. So I feel like the novel becomes more populated and more planned the further I go.
Oh, sure. Well, it's a very dynamic process. Just very briefly, I am an outliner. I spent about 8 months outlining the book, and then I write it very, very quickly. And the outline has everything in it, all the plots. And, I write very fast-paced, crime-oriented books, not psychological thrillers like yours, but it's a very fast-paced police procedural stuff. So the clues are very important, and they have to appear in various places and then pay off at the end. So, but when the outline's done, I can write the entire book in about two months or so, because I know where it's going to go. And like you, the outline becomes the document itself. So it's 140 pages, and it may say something like Coulter Shaw solves a crime here, and I don't know what it is. That's the inspirational, certainly the inspirational part. But there's nothing more subjective than writing. And I tell my students when I teach, if it works for you, it works. That's the end of the story. And if you can produce a quality product, that's all there is to it. Now, we did talk about the law a little bit, but I do have a question. Why did you give Lex that profession, or I should say, why did she choose it? And of course, Lex is the Latin word for law. So I found that just I don't know if that was intentional or not, or something subconscious, but she seems very comfortable with the profession of law. It seems to be something that gives her a certain level of stability. Is that correct, do you think?
Yeah, I think that is correct. I think that Lex is somebody who kind of takes great comfort in how just logical law is. You know, I mean, if you take a case to court, you will get a judgment. You know, it will find in someone's favor. You know, someone will be guilty or not guilty in the criminal system for the most part, with very, very few exceptions. And I think that for Lex, there is this kind of huge comfort in logic and in sort of that academic certainty that comes with the law. And I think another part of that is also the sort of landscape that her life occupies. You know, she works in a kind of law firm. You kind of get the impression it's a big corporate, you know, firm with offices, you know, in London and New York, and she spends a huge amount of time in these very sort of cold, you know, unoccupied, clean spaces. So in, you know, late night in office blocks, and, you know, traveling, and, you know, in various departure and arrivals lounges. And I think one of the things that was quite strange in creating Lex is that I found that environment so sterile and so kind of, in a way, incredibly lonely, you know, and something that I kind of found difficult to get accustomed to. Whereas I think for Lex, it's this complete solace, you know, that in contrast to the house where she has grown up, and with the kind of mess and dirt that she's kind of encountered as a child. For her, these kind of anonymous spaces are like, you know, almost sort of where she feels most at home, regardless of whether she's been there before or not. So a few people have sort of said, you know, well, is Lex's approach to law like you? And I'm like, Lex is a way better private practice, like law firm lawyer than I was. She's fantastic, and sort of made for it in a slightly twisted way.
I think nowadays we cannot stray too far from the discussion of a book without bringing in Hollywood. And I understand, maybe you could talk about this, a television series is in development, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Girl A has been optioned by Sony, and the director of HBO's Chernobyl is attached to Girl A, which is, you know, I've probably already indicated that I'm a bit of a TV addict. So the idea of kind of seeing the Gracie family and seeing the house, that the House of Horrors, you know, where they live, kind of coming to life is sort of more surreal than I think I can get my head around. It's kind of into a totally different dream factory. I think that what I'm sort of most excited about is just the idea that I think Chernobyl in particular is something, you know, it's a show that amazingly combined, you know, again, sort of bleakness with real beauty. You know, there were moments, and I think I'm thinking in particular, I think it's the end of the first episode when the residents are watching nuclear material falling on the Bridge of Death, and it's filmed.
They thought it was snow falling. I just got a chill just now thinking of that, and the kids are looking up at it. They don't realize the potential, but what an image that was. But please go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's exactly it. You know, it's filmed as this almost like, I mean, magical scene. I found, you know, it's filmed kind of beautifully, as if it's filmed, I guess, as if it is snow. Mm-hmm. But obviously, as the viewer, you know that is not the case. And I think that sort of combination of of kind of sort of, and I guess friends with writing as well, you know, of kind of a beautiful landscape or beautiful, you know, words, I guess, being used in incredibly difficult circumstances, I think is a very kind of powerful dynamic between those things.
And in Chernobyl too, there was families were affected by that, and you know, terrible decisions had to be made. And the cinematography and the camera work, I don't know who the camera operator was for Chernobyl, but if the director hews to that image, that view, I think it will make just a stunning movie, series cinematographically, if that's a word, but you get the idea. But would you consider writing the script if asked?
I don't think that will be the case. I feel like I'm not necessarily qualified. That's my current that's sort of my current position on it. I've never really done that type of writing before, and I think whereas for this I'd be kind of consulted, and I'd be kind of there in that sort of role. I think in a way I'd want to do that, and then maybe in the future take the reins. I don't know, Jeffrey, how have you found seeing your work on screen, and you know, is it strange? Is it concerning in a way, or?
It's thrilling, and whenever I hear an author say, "Oh, they took my baby, they destroyed my vision," my first question to them is, "So when did you send the check back in protest?" Because nobody sends the check back in protest. I am just thrilled. I've had I guess a feature film, an HBO, a Lifetime, an NBC series, and I am just thrilled to see it on the screen. And I have to say, I don't play well with others. My life, I'm never happier than when I'm sitting in a room that's about as illuminated as what you're looking at right now, writing my books. And you know, I work with editors, I work with professionals to help make the best book I can. But movies are, I'm so respectful and envious of the ability of directors and the camera people and the writers to create this project by, you know, team effort. That just isn't my personality. And I you know, I'm consulted from time to time, but I just, you know, want to go see it. I'll even pay, well, I used to say I'd pay my $10 and go see it in the theater. Now I'll see it on Netflix or HBO or something like that. And let's hope that changes in the near future. But I think when you see it on the screen, big or small, you will be thrilled too. This is just nothing like it. Seeing the characters that you've created, going through the journey that you've created for them. Now I just let's see. I'm just going to check our time here. I think I could go on and on talking to you, but I'm going to just limit it to about 10 more minutes, maybe a little less than that, because I'm just curious. I just have some technical questions. I found the chapters in Girl A quite interesting because each one, it's more complicated than this, but each chapter in some cases is about one of the siblings. And I think I read that you were considering maybe writing that from their point of view, but you stuck with Lex. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I did initially, I think, when I was sort of planning Girl A and sort of, you know, turning over the plot in my head, and I thought, you know, maybe every chapter could be narrated by a different sibling. And I look back and I think, you know, that would have actually been a disaster. And I think, you know, one of the reasons for that is Lex's voice. I think, you know, as soon as I sort of started writing as Lex, you know, that was it. I kind of fell in love with her, I think. And, you know, she approaches events with a really kind of wry, dry sense of humor. I think.
Yeah. She's a pleasure to spend time with. I mean, she goes through difficult things, but she's a pleasure to hang out with. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure, you know, as somebody who's read the book, Jeffrey, you're thinking, and some of those other characters would not have been a pleasure to spend time with.
We won't say who, but okay, I agree 100%.
And I think I kind of got to that conclusion as well. And I also think that having Lex guide you through this, this shared family history, it means that there are certain things that that Lex never knows. There are certain experiences that her siblings go through that she is not, does not have the full story. And I felt that that was much more loyal to a real family situation, to the fact that there are, you might have a shared childhood, but there are going to be kind of defining moments within that, and passing, things that are remembered differently. And I think it was important for me that certain things in the house would not be clarified, that there would not be this sort of universal, everyone gets to have a say approach, because I think that would be less true to how people do tend to remember their childhood. And it was always going to be Lex, after the first few planning meetings in my head.
Abigail, I have to say, I love short fiction. I just love crafting short stories. And I found some of those chapters could be, you couldn't take them out of context, of course, but they almost could be short stories unto themselves. Have you considered writing short fiction? Is that something that appeals to you?
Yeah, I love reading short fiction. I absolutely love it. And actually, particularly American short stories. I've just finished reading some Raymond Carver short stories, and just kind of absolutely in awe. I think it has so many kind of challenges, writing short fiction. I really am in awe. And I definitely, one thing I guess I would say is that one of the chapters in Girl A, there is, again, trying not to give anything away, but there's a chapter which turns to focus on a detective, and
a very interesting
that extract. That part of Girl A was a short story. That was a short story that I wrote 5 years before writing Girl A. in very, very different form, and something that I wrote across a few weeks, when I wasn't writing very much at all. So I guess never say never. There's certainly some other characters who I've recorded in old short stories, and whether they'll appear in that form or whether they'll kind of take on their own role in a novel in the future, I'm not sure. I guess you never know.
One never knows. You mentioned Raymond Carver, absolutely wonderful short story writer. And I think you've also talked about Cormac McCarthy. And if I remember correctly, you did a dissertation, or you studied him at university. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is right. I absolutely have a huge love for American literature.
Well, talk a little about your influences, if you would. And I always love asking authors that, because then I may think, oh, I discovered somebody new. I'm going to go pick up a book by him or her. And I've now learned about a new author that could impact me.
Yes, I was very obsessed with Cormac McCarthy, and I remain quite obsessed with his work, and particularly with The Road, which, I'm not sure if I can sort of go as far as saying it's my favorite novel, because that probably changes too frequently. But it's certainly going to have a constant spot in the top three. I think I just love how sort of beautiful the relationship is between the man and his son in The Road. In this most kind of awful, terrible landscape. The thing that I remember about that novel is that the kind of the sort of mundane dialogue between a man and his son, and just how kind of the power that takes on in that book. So yeah, it was something I wrote a dissertation on. My dissertation was particularly about kind of underground spaces, and sort of the spaces under the skin as well, in Cormac McCarthy's work. So it's quite a visceral dissertation, which might not be that surprising to people who have read kind of parts of Girl A. You know, that interest in those spaces around the house has really been something that's sort of been quite consistent in what I write. Another big source of inspiration was Kazuo Shigeru, and particularly his narrators. I think they are just, they have a real kind of reservation, but by the end of his novels, you feel like you know them so well in what they haven't said, or in what they're not quite willing to admit, or in the way that they kind of diverge and start talking about something else. And I think kind of with Lex as a narrator, she does not wear her heart on her sleeve. I think some readers might kind of read the first few pages and think, oh, she's relatively cold. And I would say, yeah, just keep going. Her heart is just a bit harder to get to. And I think that was something that, from Ishiguro's work that I really have always sort of admired, and it's always made me just feel so attached to these human beings he creates, who don't give very much away.
And the authors you've mentioned, and yourself as well, never commit the sin of writing on the head. It's through, in The Road, for instance, it is the mundane conversation that that the characters, as we all, that's our lives. That's why I think it relates so much to readers. A book can be that much more impactful without being lectured to. And there's a grand point, hope in Girl A, for instance, and resilience, for instance. Those are the messages, but it's not paraded out. You don't get on a soapbox and explain that. And I'm sorry, time is just sped by, but we do have to, and I want to make sure I can get to some questions here. And I am not very technologically savvy, but I think I can figure this out. Okay, there's a little box here. I'm looking. Oh, I see how it works. There's one of those little things on the side that goes up and down. I figured that part out. But I do have to ask you, of course, what's next? I will have to say that I found Girl A, let's say, perfectly realized. There are opportunities for sequels, I'm sure. And I mean, the police officer might be one of those. But I'm just wondering if you're content to let it remain as it is and move on to something else.
I am content. Yeah. I can imagine, I guess, some of the characters emerging in different ways, maybe in different stories. But I think for me, the Gracie family, Girl A is their story, and is I think that they all end up in a way where I feel the story is that the story is finished for Lex. Yeah.
Do you want to share anything about the future project?
Yeah, I can do, and it's been a very strange project to work on over the last year. It's a novel that is that deals a lot with conspiracy theories. So it's been a strange year to work on that. It takes an attack takes place at the very beginning of this novel. A very kind of violent attack, and one character loses her mother in this atrocity, and another character believes that the whole thing was a hoax, that it never took place, and that he is determined to disprove that it ever happened. And it follows those two characters over the months and then the years that pass after this attack, as they get kind of closer to conflict.
Oh, well, it sounds quite intriguing. And if you need to do any research, you can come to the United States, because we have a plethora of conspiracy theories. You open the newspaper and there's another one pops up. So Please feel free.
Yeah, it's felt. I mean, I know. I think it's in the UK that the 5G towers were sort of burnt down as
Oh,
being
yeah.
the truth of
Yes.
COVID.
Terrific.
So we've also had an interesting time, and I think one of the things this year that has been really sort of fascinating in terms of how half truths grow is that everybody is so isolated, and you don't have those dialogues that might make you question your own point of view. I think in the same way, you can I think in loneliness there is much greater kind of capacity for thinking for thinking kind of potentially quite contorted things,
Well, and
because maybe you don't have that.
I think too that in loneliness we seek sometimes rather desperately kindred souls, and there are within the within the conspiracy theory, whatever group you're talking about, whatever side, those who are reaching out to gather followers, and so you see someone, are you sympathetic, and they kind of work your way in, and you suddenly start believing things that are clearly absurd and often dangerous. But if now we've got a few minutes left, we have about 10, 15 minutes left for some questions. And forgive me for leaning closer, but the eyes aren't quite what they used to be. And I'm not going to give last names here, but I'll just read some of these. Let's see. Well, here's a question you might be interested in. Hi, Abby. Girl A is such a fantastic novel with some really complex characters. And the question essentially is, did you yourself dislike any of the characters as you were creating them, just like any of the siblings as you were creating them and writing them?
I certainly like and have greater sympathy for some of the siblings. At the same time, I do not actually dislike any of them, which hopefully doesn't make me sound too much of a monster to people who have read Girl A. I guess in terms of sort of thinking about characters and sort of writing them, I try not to think too much in terms of, okay, this is going to be like, this is a villain, like, coming up now. I guess to me the most important thing is if they feel genuine. If you can imagine, what's this character actually like as a human being. And for the most part, there don't seem to me to be many kind of good or bad human beings. That are generally kind of just pretty flawed ones who have different chemical makeups, in their brain. So yeah, while I have different feelings for some of the siblings, I don't know if I would go as far as saying that I dislike them, because I try to have some sympathy and some understanding for each of them, and I hope that's kind of what makes them feel real in their relationships and kind of
I felt
live.
that the authors have to be objective. They're like airline pilots. They see a beautiful sunset. It's beautiful. I don't care. I'm flying the airplane. I see a terrible thunderstorm. I don't care. I'm flying the airplane. Our job is to craft the characters that will resonate in the hearts of readers, and we can kind of we step back otherwise. And I see a question here from, I believe, a friend of mine. I'll say hi, Caitlin. And her question to you is, hi, Abigail. I was wondering if you could pass on some tips for actually making the writing happen during a busy schedule. Do you pre-schedule time every week? And what's your process? Thank you so much. And Caitlin's a very talented writer too, I will add.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, for the question. So I guess I should say, I had this luxurious 3 months off work, to sort of work on Girl A. And so all the advice that I'm sort of going to give comes from the period after that and at present, in terms of working a job as well. I really try to find some chunks of time at the weekends, and I sort of have the luxury of doing that at present in terms of the weekends are relatively empty. So I try to kind of get in a good few hours those days, and And the rest of the time, I just snatch the time however I can. And I used to be very, very precious about writing. Yeah, I used to kind of insist that I needed hours, I needed this notebook, I needed, absolute silence. And now I actually, if I'm going to the dentist on the bus and I think of a few lines of dialogue, I will record it in notes on my phone. And I've been quite surprised by how words do build up, even in the sort of 10, 15-minute sort of slots of time you might have. It's always, I think, worth just recording what you can and not beating yourself up about the fact that it's not been done in a sort of writerly environment, because I think that really prevented me from writing for a really long time, actually.
I'm going to sneak in one of my questions, if I may. I found Girl A just an absolutely riveting psychological study. All the characters. And for instance, Lex sees Dr. K, a psychiatrist, kind of dealing with this. How did you manage to bring such, I would say, insightful psychological profiling to each of the characters? They're all distinct, they're all different, and yet we get in their minds, and that's what kind of resonates in our hearts about each of the characters, Lex included, of course.
Yeah, so I did some reading into sort of how a childhood like the Gracie children's childhood might affect different people. So there was some sort of psychology paper reading and some reading into Stockholm syndrome, into the kind of rages that a child kind of could have if they had been subjected to what some of the children in the book are. And I think a lot of it as well was just sort of spending a really long time thinking about these characters. And that sounds kind of almost a bit kind of precious in a way, but I did just spend a really long time thinking about them, and they each became, I think, the family, a bit of an obsession. As you turn to each chapter that focuses on one of the siblings. I think that there was just a case that I fixated on them all a lot, not in writing time, but in, the commute and when I'm kind of running, which I do a lot, I was sort of wondering about these characters. And I think another thing is in a novel where time, you have characters as children and you have them as adults, in a way you get to know them across a whole lifetime. And I think that helped as well, in a way, having this sort of knowing them through, in a way, their whole lives, helped me kind of refine what they would be like as adults, in light of who they'd been as children.
Sure. Something we touched on a little earlier, I think Isa mentioned that, but you had been a bookseller. How do you think that experience informed your approach to writing, if it did at all?
I think it maybe just made me love books even more. That's probably what I say. It was a case that proofs arrived in the galleys, I think, arrived in the staff room, and so you got this like early taste of like new books, which in itself is pretty cool, and it's still something I can't quite get over as a writer, that people will want you to send you books. It's like my childhood self is like losing it right now. There was that, and there was also just a real sort of satisfaction in repeat customers who come back to chat to you about books. The idea that you can recommend something that somebody comes back and wants to talk to you about, I think just could kind of cement in a way, it cemented the kind of love that I'd had for books as a kid and as a teenager. And it was a chance to talk about them in a really kind of non-academic environment as well, just focusing on the pure sort of love and passion that someone could have for a book. So yeah, I'm not sure how much it affected my writing, but it hugely affected my kind of love for reading, and amplified that.
The whole concept of hand selling, and I as a frequent customer when I was going to physical bookstores, and when I lived in DC, frequent customer of Politics and Prose, you'd go in there and you'd say, I just finished this book. What? And I've read everything by this author, but could you recommend somebody else? And bang, right away they turn you on to someone else, and that's the process. These miraculous little things we call books. There's just nothing like it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know about you, but I think it's one of the things that around lockdown that I found sort of both as a writer and a reader most completely rubbish is not being able to meet readers and not being able to meet booksellers and sort of just not being able to say thank you or chat about Girl A and chat about other books. Yeah, it's been that's probably been the only thing I'd say in terms of publishing in a pandemic that's been really rotten.
One of the things I love about the UK is the wonderful book festivals there. Just throughout there was Dead on Deansgate in Manchester. I think we don't see that anymore, even before the pandemic. But that was at the Waterstones centered there in Manchester. And that's something that we miss. It's just the Edinburgh Festival, Harrogate. There's just so many wonderful festivals that we're missing now. We have them in the United States too, but we'll look forward to that in future years.
Well.
All right. Well, on that note, this is a perfect lead-in for my question. This is a great Politics and Prose question that we like to ask all of our guests. So what are you guys currently reading? What would you like to suggest? What is occupying your bedside table? Please do share what has caught your fancy these days.
Well, if you're asking about the immediate book I'm reading, I just finished a great book. It's a tradesperson book called Open in 30 Seconds, and it's about breaking a particular type of lock, because my book coming out in the fall is about basically a psychotic locksmith who can break into any lock under any circumstances. And I get fascinated with the topic. In like The Broken Window, it was data mining. In The Cutting Edge, it was about the diamond trade. And this book, the Midnight Lock in November, is all about somebody. You'll never be safe in any apartment or house or vault ever again if you run into my fellow. It's my job to terrify the populace. So anyway, in answer to your question, I read a lot because I write 2 books a year. I do a lot of research. So I wish I could say something literary, Proust or something like that, or Flaubert, but no, sadly it's a trade book, but a very good one.
And yeah.
Yeah, Proust is also not currently on my bedside table. Next week. So I've really recently finished Ask Again, Yes by Mary Beth Keane, which I was kind of pretty slow to get to in a way, and I just loved it. One of the things that I admired kind of hugely is, it's a story about 2 families in upstate New York, and a sort of act of violence that kind of tears them apart, and the repercussions of that. And there's these massive kind of chunks of time that she writes about. The span of the book must be like 40 or 50 years, I think. Oh, wow. But she does it with kind of 5-year period can be described so beautifully and so specifically, and it has a real specific feeling despite the sort of swathe of the years. It's also a very, very kind of moving story about mental illness at a time when it was not really understood, and the impact that has on certain characters. So yeah, I know a lot of US readers might already have read that, but it was great.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing what you guys are reading right now. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you, Abigail. And thank you to the audience. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of amazing events without the book sales to support them. So please support our wonderful guests and Politics and Prose by using the link in the chat to purchase Girl A by Abigail Dean. And any of Jeffery Deaver's books, along with any of his other works. So check our website for the most current updated event listings, as we have a great list to choose from. And we do hope to see you all there. And thank you again for joining us this evening. And thank you one last time to Abigail and Jeffery for your time. Stay strong, stay safe, and stay well read, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thanks, Isa. Thanks, Jeff.